Sign it, now, while I'm still offering you the quiet way out. Termination for cause. 8 years I've worked this line, Dale. What cause? It's all in the report. Read it to me. You want it read out loud? Fine. Employee created and failed to correct a condition that endangered a guest, including a minor. Corporate's here Thursday for the safety audit. I can't have a question mark in this store when they walk in. A minor. You're putting a child in this. I'm putting what happened in this. What happened is I caught that girl before she hit the floor. And you're the one who pulled the mats to make a labor number. But that part's not in your report, is it, Dale? Sign the paper, Wyatt. I filed work orders on that front ramp for 6 months. In writing. I've got copies at home. You want to talk about who put people at risk in this building? I want you to sign the paper and go home to your daughter.
That last part landed like a slap, because it was meant to. Wyatt picked up the pen. His hand was steady. He signed his name on a line that called him a danger, and he set the pen down on the steel, and he pushed through the back door into a January that had teeth. He did not know that in 2 weeks he would hand his last warm meal to a freezing stranger on a bench. He did not know she was the one person alive who could give all of this back. He only knew, walking to a truck with a bad heater, that his daughter was going to ask what happened, and that he did not have a word for it a 5-year-old could hold. Her name was Poppy. She was 5, and she believed her father could fix anything, because so far in her life he always had. Wyatt had grown up believing nobody could fix anything. He had come up in the kind of childhood people lower their voices about, moved 11 times before he was 14, houses that were not homes, a duffel bag that was the only thing that was always his. He had learned young that when you are a child, nobody has to be kind to. Kindness comes at you sideways and rare, and you remember every single time it does. He remembered one time most of all. He had been 12, and it was winter, and he was standing outside the back of a diner because the front cost money he didn't have, and a cook came out to throw the trash and found him there. The cook did not ask questions. He went back inside and came out with a plate, and here was the thing Wyatt never forgot. The plate was warm. Not just the food, the plate. The man had run it under hot water first so the food wouldn't go cold before a hungry kid could eat it. And he'd said, setting it down, "No one eats cold on a cold night. Not while I've got a stove." Wyatt became a cook because of that plate. He did not become one to get rich. Nobody gets rich on a diner line. He became one so that he could be the man with the warm plate. And every night for 8 years at Holloway's, when the last customer came in frozen and broke and ashamed, Wyatt ran their plate under the hot tap first, and he never told anybody why. He did it for Poppy, too. He warmed her little plastic plate before her eggs every morning, and she thought that was just how eggs worked. And one morning, she had explained it to him with great seriousness, the way 5-year-olds explain the world back to you. "You have to warm the plate first," Poppy said, "so the food isn't lonely." He'd had to turn around and pretend to look for something in the fridge so she wouldn't see his face. Poppy's mother had left when Poppy was 2. She had not been cruel about it. She had simply been young and drowning and unable to stay, and she'd gone to her own mother's, 3 states away, and mostly what was left of that marriage now was a woman named Diane Voss, who had never thought Wyatt was good enough for her daughter, and had said so, and who called every few months to remind him that if things ever fell apart for him, she and her lawyer were watching. Diane Voss believed a child belonged with money and a spare bedroom, and Wyatt had a rented half of a duplex and a job at a diner, and the only thing that had ever kept Poppy with her father instead of in a courtroom was that Wyatt was, on paper, and in fact, a steady man. A man who showed up. A man with a job and a clean record and a landlord who'd vouch for him. Termination for cause, endangerment, negligence. Those 3 words had detonated all of it, and Wyatt understood that before he was even out of the parking lot. The next 2 weeks taught him what for cause does to a man. Unemployment denied him. You don't collect when you're fired for endangering people. He applied at 4 other kitchens in town, and 3 of them called Holloway's, and Dale's report was the reference, and the calls stopped coming. He sat in the truck outside the last one, the one that had seemed like a sure thing, and read the rejection on his phone. And for one long minute, He put his forehead on the wheel and let himself understand exactly how far a lie could travel when it had a company's letterhead behind it. Then Diane Voss called. "I heard," she said. And she didn't sound happy exactly, but she sounded certain, which was worse. "I heard you were let go. For something with a child, Wyatt. Endangering a child." "That's not what happened. It's what the paperwork says, and paperwork is what a judge reads." A pause. "Expensive and clean. I'm not doing this to hurt you. I'm doing it because that little girl deserves stability, and you can't even keep a job flipping eggs. My attorney will be in touch. We're requesting a review of custody. There'll be a home visit. She's happy, Diane. She's got everything she needs. She's got a father who was fired for endangering a child. Read that sentence back to yourself and tell me a judge won't." "That's not what happened." "Diane." "Friday," she said, "a caseworker. Have the place clean." And she hung up, and Wyatt sat in a cold truck holding a phone, and the word she'd used sat in his chest like a stone. A child. They were going to take his child from him using a lie about a child. And the awful, laughing cruelty of it was that Wyatt Corbin had spent his entire life making sure no child ever felt the way he had felt at 12, cold and hungry and invisible behind a diner. He told Poppy none of it. He told her he was between jobs, which she took to mean a kind of vacation, and she was delighted, because it meant Daddy was home. That first morning home, she watched him warm her plate under the hot tap and asked, "Is it a snow day for grown-ups?" "Something like that," Wyatt said. "Good. Then you can do the eggs the slow way." She meant the warm plate. "The food likes it when you're not in a hurry." "Does it now?" "It told me," Poppy said, with the total authority of a person who is 5. And he laughed for the first time in days, a short surprise sound that hurt and helped in the same breath. They had 6 days until Friday. Wyatt spent them scrubbing a duplex that was already clean and rehearsing sentences he could say to a stranger with a clipboard, and losing. It was the 6th night, the night before the home visit, that they met the old woman on the bench. They had walked to the corner store, Poppy in her puffy coat that was a size too big so it would last 2 winters, because Wyatt had almost nothing left, and a walk was free, and a 5-year-old needs to burn the day off before she'll sleep. The cold that night was the serious kind, the kind that makes the streetlights look brittle, and on the bench outside the shuttered building on Fuller Street, the one that had been boarded up, as long as Wyatt could remember, there was an old woman sitting alone, and she was not dressed for it. She was maybe 75, in a good wool coat that had been expensive a long time ago, and she had no hat and no gloves, and she was sitting very straight and very still, the way people sit when they have decided to feel something all the way through and not flinch. She was looking at the boarded-up building like it was a person. Poppy stopped walking. Poppy had no filter yet between seeing a thing and saying it. "You don't have gloves," she told the old woman. The old woman turned. Up close, her face was fine and lined, and her eyes were very sharp, not confused at all, just tired in the specific way of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time. "No," she agreed. "I don't." "You're cold." "I am a little cold, yes." Wyatt should have kept walking. He had $4 and change in his pocket. A home visit in the morning that would decide whether he got to keep his daughter, and not one single thing to spare for a stranger. But he had a thermos in his coat, the dented steel thermos he carried everywhere, out of habit, still half full of the soup he'd made for their dinner, and he had a childhood that would not let him walk past a cold person on a cold night. And some things are stronger than sense. "Ma'am," he said, crouching down to her level, "I've got some soup here. It's still hot. Would you take some?" She looked at him for a moment, and something moved behind her eyes that he couldn't read. "I couldn't take your dinner." "You're not taking it. I'm offering it. There is a difference." He unscrewed the cup that formed the thermos lid, and then he did the thing he always did, without thinking, the thing his hands did on their own. He poured a little hot soup into the cup, swirled it to warm the metal, and tipped that first bit back into the thermos. Then he filled the warmed cup and held it out. "There. Now it won't go cold on you before you're done." The old woman did not take the cup right away. She was staring at his hands. "You warmed the cup first," she said. Her voice had changed. It had gone careful. "Habit," Wyatt said. "Cold cup steals the heat right out of the food. He almost said something and didn't. "Somebody taught me that a long time ago." "Daddy always does it," Poppy announced, climbing onto the bench, uninvited, and sitting down next to a total stranger with the trust only very small children have. "So the food isn't lonely." The old woman took the cup then. Her hands were shaking, and Wyatt thought it was the cold, and it was not the cold. She drank and closed her eyes, and for a moment she looked like a woman who had walked a very long way and been let inside at last. When she opened them, they were wet. "That's the best thing I've had in a year," she said, and she wasn't talking about the soup, and Wyatt didn't understand that yet. They stayed 20 minutes on that freezing bench. He gave her the rest of the soup. Poppy told her everything, because Poppy told everyone everything, that Daddy was between jobs, that they were having a special cleanup day tomorrow, that her coat was big so it would last, that her name was Poppy, like the flower. "And what do you do, Poppy like the flower?" the old woman asked. "I'm 5, Poppy said, as if that were a whole profession. "And I help Daddy warm the plates. That's my main job." "That sounds like a very important job." "It is," said Poppy, satisfied that someone finally understood. The old woman said her name was Ginny. She asked Poppy good questions and listened to the answers, like they mattered. And when Wyatt finally said they had to get the little one to bed, the old woman caught his sleeve. "Young man, what do I owe you?" "Nothing. It's soup." "I'd like to give you something." "No, ma'am." And here he almost smiled, the first almost smile in 2 weeks, because some reflex from 8 years on the line came up in him, some old muscle memory of the man he'd been before Dale Prentice called him a danger. He reached into his coat and pulled out the thing that was always there, a slim pad of green guest checks, the kind every Holloway's cook carried, soft-cornered from his pocket. He clicked a pen. He wrote on the top check the way he'd written 1,000 of them, and he tore it off and pressed it into her cold hand. She looked down at it. In the streetlight, she read what he'd written. Item, 1 bowl of soup, and under the price, where the number should go, he had written, "No charge." On the house, and under that, in small careful letters, the only rule he had ever needed. The old woman made a sound that was not quite a word. She folded the little green check in half, and then in half again, and she held it against the front of her coat, over her heart with both bare hands. Exactly the way you would hold something you had been looking for so long, you had stopped believing you'd find it. "Good night, Ginny," Poppy said. "Good night, Poppy like the flower," the old woman said, and her voice broke on the flower. Wyatt did not know that he had just handed a Holloway's guest check to Genevieve Holloway. He did not know that the building she was sitting in front of, the one boarded up on Fuller Street, was the very first Holloway's. Opened in 1958 by a young man named Earl Holloway with $40 and one idea, that no person should have to eat cold and alone on a cold night, and that he would run the plate under hot water himself to prove it. He did not know that Earl had died 6 years ago, after 52 years of marriage, or that his widow came to this bench every year on the night he died, because it was the only place on earth she could still feel him, and that she came alone and unrecognized on purpose, because everywhere else in her life people saw the $3 billion and the 400 diners and the name on the sign, and nobody in 6 years had simply seen a cold old woman and warmed a cup so her supper wouldn't go lonely. Genevieve Holloway went home that night to a house with 11 rooms and a live-in staff and a driver who had been frantic looking for her, and she said nothing to any of them. And she went up to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and unfolded a soft green guest check and read it again, and wept the way you weep when a door you thought was walled up turns out to only have been shut. She had, on her desk in that house, a personnel report. It had come up to her 3 days earlier in a stack of things her family foundation flagged, an appeal that had been denied at every level, a former employee claiming wrongful termination. She had barely glanced at it. It was 1 page in a company of tens of thousands. The name at the top of it was Wyatt Corbin. She had not made the connection on the bench. She made it at 2 in the morning, holding the guest check, when Poppy's voice came back to her, saying Daddy's between jobs. And Genevieve Holloway sat very still in a very large house and understood, with a cold clarity that felt like grief and like fury at the same time, that the company her husband had built on 1 sentence about warm plates had fired the last man in it who still believed the sentence, and had called him a danger for it. The home visit was the next morning. The caseworker was a tired, decent woman named Mrs. Okonkwo who had seen every kind of home and was hard to fool in either direction. She walked through the clean duplex and wrote things down. She watched Poppy show off her room and her rock collection and the drawing on the fridge of 3 people and a bench, which Poppy explained was me and Daddy and Ginny, who was cold. She asked Wyatt the questions, and Wyatt answered them steady, and it was going all right. It was going as all right as such a thing can go, until she got to the last page on her clipboard. Mr. Corbin, I have to ask about your employment. There's a termination on record for cause. She said it gently, but she said it. The stated cause is endangerment and negligence, involving a minor guest. She looked up. You understand that in a custody review, that's the kind of thing that carries weight. I have to note it. I have to note that I couldn't verify your side, because your former employer will only confirm the official record. I filed work orders on that hazard for 6 months, Wyatt said. I have the copies. Copies of work orders show you knew about a hazard, Mrs. Okonkwo said, not unkindly. They don't show whose fault it was. Do you have anyone who can corroborate what actually happened? A witness? Anyone? And Wyatt Corbin, who had done everything right, who had documented everything, who had spent his whole life being careful, precisely so that no one could ever do this to him, opened his mouth and found he had no one. There'd been a young mother in the diner that morning with a toddler. He didn't know her name. There'd been Dale, who was lying. There'd been no camera on the floor that worked, because the floor cameras had been down for months. Another thing he'd filed a work order about. No, he said, there's no one. Mrs. Okonkwo wrote that down too. At the door, she paused, and off the record said, For what it's worth, this is a good home. But good isn't always what wins these. Get someone to speak for you if you can. You've got until the review. How do I get someone to speak for me, Wyatt said, when the only people who know the truth are the man who lied and a mother whose name I never got? I don't have an answer for that, Mrs. Okonkwo said honestly. I only know I've watched good men lose these for want of one voice in the right room. Find your voice, Mr. Corbin. It's the only thing that wins these. And she left, and Wyatt stood in his clean, doomed duplex, and Poppy tugged his hand and asked if they could go see Jenny again, and he said yes, because he could not think of a single other good thing in the world he could still give his daughter. They went back to the bench the next evening, not really expecting her, and she was there. She was there the evening after that, too. It became, over the following days, a thing they did. Wyatt would bring the thermos, and Jenny would bring, it turned out, an appetite for Poppy's endless narration and a way of asking Wyatt questions that made him talk more than he meant to. He did not think it strange that a well-spoken old woman kept meeting them on a bench in the cold. He thought she was lonely. He was right about that. He was only wrong about the size of the house she was lonely in. One evening, she asked him why he'd become a cook, of all the things a person could be. Because somebody fed me once when I had nothing, Wyatt said. Warmed the plate and everything. I was a kid. I didn't have a word for what that did to me. So I decided I'd grow up and be the guy who does it. And the man who fed you, did you ever find him again? No, never even got his name. He turned the thermos cup slowly in his hands. But I figure if I keep the thing going, it counts as thanking him. You pass it on because you can't pass it back. Jenny was quiet for a long moment. That, she said at last, is the truest thing I've heard in 6 years. 6 years is awful specific. It is, she said, and did not explain it. And he let her keep it, because everyone on that bench was keeping something. Genevieve, for her part, was doing something she had not done in years, which was learn a person from the ground up, with no name to go on, and no number attached to them. She learned that Wyatt Corbin flinched at the word charity like it was a raised hand. She learned that he had a temper that never went out and only ever went in, quiet and flat. A man who would take a blow before he'd take a favor. She learned that he loved his daughter, with a ferocity that had a fear underneath it, the specific fear of a man who had once been a child no one kept. And she learned, on the 4th evening, what had been done to him, because Poppy fell asleep against the old woman's side, and Wyatt, in the low voice men use over a sleeping child, finally told the whole story to someone. The ramp, the work orders, the morning a toddler slipped, and he'd caught the child before anything happened and set her back on her feet, and how the mother had thanked him, and how 3 days later Dale had turned that morning inside out on paper and made him the villain of it, because corporate was coming, and Dale had cut the mats and the busser to hit a labor number and needed the blame to land anywhere but on Dale. And now they're going to take Poppy, Wyatt said. To the dark, to the old woman, to no one. Because a company decided I was a danger. And I can't fight a company. Nobody can. You can't outshout a letterhead. Genevieve Holloway sat with a sleeping 5-year-old breathing against her ribs and the whole weight of what she was and had not yet said, pressing on her chest. And she made a decision that would cost her a great deal. And she said only, sometimes people surprise you. Not people like me. Not against people like them. Especially people like you, she said. I've known a lot of people like them. They're mostly frightened. Frightened people fold when someone finally isn't. She could have told him then. She thought about it every evening. But she had learned, in 6 years of being seen only as a fortune, that if she told this man who she was, one of two things would happen. He would ask her for help, and the thing between them would become a transaction, and she could not bear that. Or he would do the other thing, the Wyatt thing, and go cold and flat and proud and shut the door. Because he would understand that she owned the company that had branded him, that she was, in some sense, the letterhead. And she was not ready to lose the bench. She had lost so much. For a few evenings she wanted to be Ginny, a cold woman a kind man had warmed a cup for, and not Genevieve Holloway, who could buy the whole street. So instead of telling him, she began quietly to move. "Colin," she said on the phone that night, "I want the whole file on a man named Wyatt Corbin. Not the one-page appeal. Everything. Every review, every work order, every labor report out of that store, going back 2 years. May I ask what I'm looking for?" "A frightened man's fingerprints," Genevieve said. "They're always on the paperwork. People who lie to save themselves can never quite stop writing it down." She had her assistant, that careful young man, pull the full file. Not the one-page appeal, but everything. Wyatt's 8 years of reviews, every one of them strong. The work orders, all of them, date-stamped, ignored. The store's labor reports, showing Dale Prentice cutting positions to the bone the same quarter the accident started climbing. The incident report itself, which Genevieve read 4 times and which did not survive a careful reading, because Dale had been sloppy the way frightened people are sloppy, and had written that the hazard was unaddressed by kitchen staff. On a date that came after Wyatt's 9th work order about exactly that hazard. She found the young mother, too. Colin was good. It took him 2 days. Her name was Marin, and when Colin's careful call reached her, she said, "Wait, the cook got fired? He caught my daughter. That man saved Ollie from a bad fall and they fired him? I'll say that to anybody you want." Genevieve found the floor cameras had been down for months. So there was no footage, no clean video that would make this easy. And she was, in a strange way, almost glad because she had spent her life watching money make things easy, and she had come to distrust easy. This would have to be done with people, with a mother willing to speak, and a paper trail, and, if she could manage it, a frightened man's own mouth. And she did one more thing, the thing that mattered most, and was smallest. On the evening before Wyatt had a real interview, a good one, a chance at a kitchen 2 towns over where Dale's poison hadn't reached, Wyatt stood on the sidewalk near the bench, nearly sick with it, because he had no one to leave Poppy with, and could not bring a 5-year-old to an interview, and could not afford to miss it. "I'll watch her," Ginny said. "I can't ask you." "You didn't. I offered. There's a difference. You told me so yourself." And she took Poppy for 3 hours to the diner around the corner, a Holloway's, and bought her grilled cheese, and let her narrate. And she watched a stranger's child with the fierce attentiveness of a woman who'd had a great deal of love in her life. And, since Earl, nowhere to put it. Wyatt got the interview. He got, tentatively, the job, pending references, and everyone knew what pending references meant. But for one afternoon, he'd had somewhere to stand. He came back to find Poppy asleep in a booth, and the old woman watching her. And something in his chest that he had kept clenched for 2 weeks came loose about half a turn. "Thank you," he said, and meant it all the way down. "How'd she do?" "She ran the diner for 3 hours, told the cook how to do his job." Jenny smiled. "How did you do?" "They want me. Pending references." He heard how the word tasted in his mouth. Which means they don't want me once they call. But for one afternoon, somebody looked at my name, and not the report. And I'd forgotten what that felt like. "Hold on to that feeling," Ginny said. "You're going to need to remember it wasn't the lie. You talk like you already know how this ends." "I know how it ought to end," she said. "Sometimes that's the same thing. If enough stubborn people decide it is." "She warmed my plate," Poppy mumbled, half asleep. And Wyatt looked at Ginny, and Ginny looked back at him with an expression he couldn't name. And it was the truth. At the diner, when the grilled cheese came, the old woman had sent it back and asked, to the confusion of the young server, for the plate to be warmed first, because she had learned something on a bench, and she was not going to unlearn it. That was the high point. That was the top of the small, warm world they'd built. It came apart 3 days later, and it came apart because of a photograph. Diane Voss's attorney was thorough. Someone had been by the neighborhood asking about Wyatt, building the custody case, and someone had taken a phone photo of the fired cook, accused of endangering a child, sitting on a public bench night after night, with an unrelated elderly woman and a small girl. And someone had done what people do, which is find out who the elderly woman was. Because her face, it turned out, was not actually anonymous to everyone. It was in the lobby of a building downtown, cast in bronze. And the attorney, smelling something useful and strange, sent the whole packet over, and it landed, by a route Wyatt never fully understood, in Wyatt's own hands, forwarded by Diane, with a single line. "Do you even know who you've been letting near our daughter?" He knew Ginny's face in the photograph. He did not know the other face, the bronze one, the plaque beneath it. Genevieve Holloway, Chair Emeritus Holloway's. And under a corporate logo he had worn on his chest for 8 years. The logo that was on the report that called him a danger. The logo on the guest check he'd handed her on the bench. Wyatt stood in his kitchen and felt the floor go out from under him in a way it hadn't since he was a child in a house that wasn't his. She owned it. She owned all of it. The company that fired him, the report, the reference that killed every job, the letterhead he'd said you couldn't outshout. He had sat on a bench and poured out his whole ruin to the woman at the very top of the thing that ruined him. And she had let him. She had let him think she was a lonely stranger. She had warmed a plate and babysat his daughter and asked her gentle questions and known, the whole time, known who he was, because his name was on a report on her desk. Every kind thing she'd done rearranged itself in his mind into something unbearable. A project, a guilty conscience taking the shape of soup, charity, the raised hand, the one thing he could not stand. She was on the bench that evening. Of course she was. You knew, Wyatt said. He didn't sit down. Poppy wasn't with him. He'd left her with the neighbor, because he'd known this was going to be a thing a child shouldn't see. This whole time, you're Genevieve Holloway. You own the company that fired me. You read the report. You knew who I was the second I opened my mouth about it, and you let me sit here and... His voice did the thing. Quiet, flat, worse than shouting. Was I a project? Something to feel good about? The little charity cook and his kid, so you could tell yourself the company still has a heart? Wyatt, don't. He was shaking. You know what I've got? One thing. I've got that I never took a handout. That whatever they did to me, I earned my daughter honest every day with my own 2 hands. And you sat here and turned me into somebody's good deed. You made me the cold person on the bench. His breath clouded between them. I warmed a cup for you because no one should eat cold. Not because I wanted anything. And you knew that. And you let me. Knowing you could fix the whole thing with one phone call and choosing instead to watch me pour out my life like it was theater. Genevieve Holloway took that without flinching. Because she had earned some of it, and she knew it. When she spoke, her voice was steady and old and very tired. I didn't tell you, she said, because the moment I did, I'd stop being a person you were kind to and start being a person who could use you. And I have been used, and I have used, and I am so tired of it that I sat on a public bench in January, hoping to feel invisible for 1 hour a year. You made me visible. Do you understand what you did? 6 years since my husband died, everyone who looks at me sees the money. You saw a cold woman and you warmed a cup. That was the truest thing anyone has done for me since Earl. And I could not bear to poison it by telling you it was, in some accounting you didn't ask for, owed. That's very moving, Wyatt said. You still let a lie about me stand for 2 weeks while it took my job, and now it's going to take my kid. It is not going to take your kid. You don't get to promise that. I get to promise that, Genevieve said. And for the first time on that bench, the old woman was gone, and something else was in her place. Something that had built 400 diners. Because it's my name on the door. Come Thursday, you'll see exactly what I get to promise. I don't want your Thursday. I don't want your phone call. I don't want to be the thing the billionaire fixed to feel warm. He was already turning away. Stay away from my daughter. That last one was the cruelest thing he had in him. And he threw it, because he was a man who threw things inward. And it was the only way he had left to hurt. And it landed, and he saw it land. And he hated himself and kept walking anyway. Genevieve sat alone on the bench in the dark, which was how she'd started, and she took out the soft green guest check, and she held it to her chest. And for a little while she let herself be exactly as alone as she'd felt for 6 years. Then she folded it away, and she stood up, an old woman with a very straight back, and she went to make some phone calls because she had told a frightened, proud man that come Thursday he'd see what she could promise. And Genevieve Holloway had not stayed married to Earl for 52 years and buried him and kept his company's soul on life support by breaking her word. That was the dark part. The next 2 days were darker. Wyatt's tentative job called. References had come back, and they were sorry. The custody review was set. Diane's attorney had the photograph now, the fired cook and the mystery heiress, and was spinning it into instability. Poor judgment. A man so desperate he was working some angle on a vulnerable old woman, and it did not matter that it was the opposite of true, because the truth had no letterhead, and the lie had two. Wyatt sat up the second night in the clean duplex after Poppy was asleep and did the math of his life and could not make it come out. With his daughter still in it. He had done everything right. He had documented everything. He had never taken a handout. And he was going to lose her anyway. To a lie. And the one person who'd offered to help was the owner of the lie. And he had told her to stay away, and he did not know. Sitting there at the kitchen table at 3 a.m, whether the thing that had broken in him at the diner counter 2 weeks ago would ever set right again. He almost called her. Twice he had the neighbor's number up, the one place he'd have to start. And twice he put the phone down because pride is a wall you build to survive being 12, and it does not come down because you've grown. Thursday was the reopening of the original Holloways on Fuller Street. Wyatt didn't know that either, not at first. What he knew was that on Thursday morning a letter came by courier, heavy stock, and it was not from a lawyer. It was one line, in a shaking, elegant, old-fashioned hand. Come to Fuller Street at noon. Bring Poppy. Bring your work orders. You said you can't outshout a letterhead. Come see. G.H. He should not have gone. Every proud cell in his body said don't go. But Poppy had a drawing on the fridge of 3 people and a bench. And the review was in 2 days. And a man with nothing left will follow a thread, if it's the only thread. And so at noon, Wyatt Corbin walked down Fuller Street holding his daughter's hand and a folder of 6-months-old work orders, and found the boarded-up building unboarded. They had taken the plywood off overnight. The old diner stood there in the cold light, exactly as it must have looked in 1958. The long counter, the row of booths, the neon that said Holloway's buzzing to life for the first time in years. And it was full of people. Not customers, press a little, corporate a lot. Regional managers and executives, and a tall, careful man Wyatt would learn was named Preston Cole, who ran the whole company day to day. And Dale Prentice, in his best suit, near the back, looking like a man who did not know why he'd been summoned, and was afraid he did. And at the counter, behind it, in an apron, stood a 76-year-old woman worth $3 billion, warming a plate under the hot tap. The room quieted when Wyatt came in, because a number of people in it had seen the photograph and knew the shape of this story, or thought they did. Genevieve Holloway looked up from the plate and found him in the doorway with his daughter and his folder. And she did not smile in triumph or relief. She just looked at him the way she had on the bench, like he was a person and not a number, and she said into the quiet to the whole room, but really only to him, "My husband opened this diner in 1958 with $40 and one rule. He put it on the wall right there." She nodded to a hand-painted sign, newly uncovered over the pass. The one rule the whole place had been built on. For 50 years he ran the first plate under hot water himself, every service, so that a cold person's supper wouldn't go cold in front of them. He said a warm plate is how you tell somebody they were expected, that they're not invisible. He built 400 diners on that sentence. Her voice did not waver, but her hands did, there on the counter. And somewhere in the building of 400 diners, we stopped saying it. We started saying other things. Labor targets. Shrink. Liability. Termination for cause. She looked at Preston Cole when she said it, and the tall man had the grace to look at the floor. We got so good at running a company that we forgot we were running Earl's company. And then, 2 weeks ago, a man on this payroll ran a plate under hot water for a cold old woman on a bench who he thought was nobody. He didn't know who I was. He had $4 in his pocket and a home visit in the morning that could cost him his child. And he gave me his dinner and warmed the cup so it wouldn't go cold. And he charged me nothing. She reached under the counter and brought out the soft green guest check, unfolded it, and held it up so the whole room could see the handwriting. He wrote me a check. It says no charge. It says on the house. And under that, it says the only thing my husband ever wanted this company to be. She set the check on the counter. Then she set the warm plate down beside it, a plain plate with a plain sandwich, warm to the touch, and she looked at Wyatt across the whole room full of the people who had branded him. "Come sit down," Genevieve Holloway said. "You must be cold. No one eats cold on a cold night. Not in my husband's house." Wyatt Corbin stood in the doorway and did not move, because his pride was a wall, and the wall was all he had. And then Poppy, who had no walls, let go of his hand and walked across the whole silent room and climbed up onto a counter stool in front of the warm plate and said, "Daddy, she warmed it. Come on." And he came. He crossed the room and sat down next to his daughter, and Genevieve slid the warm plate in front of him. And it was the single most public and least charitable meal of his life, because it was not given down to him from a height. It was set in front of him by a woman who had learned, on a bench, from him, why you warm the plate. Two people who had both been treated as things, a fortune and a danger, a letterhead and a case number, sitting at a counter over one warm plate. He put his hand on it and felt the heat, and something that had been clenched in him since he was 12 years old finally let go the rest of the way, and he had to put his other hand over his eyes, at a counter in front of corporate. And no one in that room said a word. Poppy leaned into his side and studied the old woman behind the counter. "Are you our grandma now?" she asked. "Only if the two of you will have me," Genevieve said, "which is more than I've dared ask anyone in a long time." "Okay," said Poppy, deciding it on the spot, the way 5-year-olds settled the largest questions. And that was that. Then Genevieve Holloway took off the apron and became the other thing she was. "Preston," she said, "the termination of Wyatt Corbin is rescinded, effective the date it was issued, with back pay, and the record corrected to reflect that he was wrongfully dismissed. I've read the file, all of it. I'd like everyone here to understand what's in it, because you're going to be cleaning up after it for a while." And she laid it out plainly, the way she'd read it 4 times at her desk. The work orders, ignored, the mats, and the busser, cut to hit a number, the incident report that blamed kitchen staff for a hazard on a date after the 9th work order about that hazard, the young mother, Marin, who was in fact standing near the door because Genevieve had asked her to come, and who now said into the quiet clearly, "He caught my daughter. He's the reason nothing happened. I've been trying to say that for 2 weeks and nobody would take my call." And then the hard part, the part with no video. Genevieve turned to the back of the room, to Dale Prentice in his best suit, and the whole thing narrowed to the two of them. "Dale," she said, "there's no camera footage. You know that. You filed the work order about the cameras yourself and then let it sit, same as the ramp. So there's no tape that makes this easy. It comes down to what a man will say with his own mouth in front of the people he said the other thing to." She was not cruel. That was the strange, terrible mercy of it. "I looked into you too. I know your mother's care runs $11,000 a month, and I know what the regional targets have been since Preston's people took over, and I know you were told to cut, or be cut, and you cut, and then when it went wrong you did what frightened people do. I understand it. I'm not going to pretend I don't understand it." She let that sit. "But understanding it isn't the same as letting it stand. So here's what happens now. You can keep lying, and I'll take it apart in a deposition with that paper trail, and you'll lose the job. And maybe worse. Or you can tell these people right now, with your own mouth, what actually happened. And if you do that, if you have the courage to unmake the lie in the same room you made it, then we'll talk about your mother and your job and a way back. But it starts with the truth, out loud, from you. Not because I made you, because you chose it." It was very quiet in the original Holloways. Dale Prentice stood there in his good suit and his fear, and everyone watched him. And for a long moment it could have gone either way, because a lie is a kind of shelter, and it is very cold outside of one. And then something in the man's face came apart, the way a thing comes apart when you finally stop holding it, and he said, not loudly, "I cut the mats and the busser to hit the number. He filed the orders and I sat on them. When the kid slipped he caught her and I—" His voice cracked. "Corporate was coming. I needed it to be his fault. I wrote it up. I lied. He's the best cook I ever had, and I called him a danger to save my own." He stopped. He looked at Wyatt, and it cost him everything he had. Which was the point. "I'm sorry, that's not enough. But I'm sorry." Wyatt didn't say it's okay because it wasn't, and everyone in that room would have known it for a lie. And this was a room done with lies. He just looked at Dale, and nodded once, the way you acknowledge a debt has been named even if it can't be paid. And that was all. And it was somehow enough for the room to breathe again. The rest happened fast, the way things do once the truth is standing up in the open. Preston Cole, who had wanted no camera on this at all, found himself agreeing to a great many things with Genevieve Holloway's eyes on him. The record was corrected that afternoon. The corrected record, hand-signed by the chair emeritus, went by courier to a tired caseworker named Mrs. Okonkwo and to Diane Voss's attorney, along with a signed statement from a witness named Marin and a plain letter in an old woman's elegant hand that said Wyatt Corbin was the most trustworthy man she had met in 6 years, and that she would say so to any judge in the state, in person, and would they like to schedule it. Diane Voss's custody review evaporated the way threats do when the letterhead switches sides. 2 days later, Mrs. Okonkwo called Wyatt herself, off the record, and said, "You got someone to speak for you after all." And he could hear that she was glad. But the reason it held, the reason it was not just a rescue but a mending, was that Wyatt would not take it the easy way, and Genevieve did not offer it the easy way. And that is a different story than the one where money fixes everything. Because when the room had cleared, when it was just the two of them, and Poppy at the counter of the old diner, Genevieve had said, "I want you to run this place. Not a job, yours. Reopen the original the way Earl made it. Name your salary." And it was everything. A fortune, a future, a wall between Poppy and cold forever. And Wyatt Corbin looked at it and did the Wyatt thing and said no. "Wyatt, I don't want it given to me. I told you. If you hand me this because you feel bad, then Diane's right. Then I'm a man who worked an angle on an old woman, and I'll know it even if no one else ever does. And someday, Poppy will ask me how I got it, and I need the answer to be true." He wasn't flat and cold now. He was just clear. "Clear my name. That's the only thing I ever wanted from you. And it wasn't money. It was my name. So my daughter can say what her dad does and have it be a good thing. You've done that. That's enough. That's more than enough. I'll find work now that the lie's off me." And Genevieve Holloway, who had spent 6 years being seen only as a thing to be asked, looked at the one man who wouldn't ask, and she understood him, because she was the same, and she loved him for it a little. The plain way an old woman loves a good young man. "Then don't take it as a gift," she said. "Take it as a job you'll earn every day, same as any other, and I'll dock you if you're late. I'm not offering you charity, Wyatt. I'm offering you Earl's stove. Somebody has to be the man who warms the plate. I've been looking for him for 6 years. She put her old hand flat on the warm counter. "You're not the cold person I let inside. You're the one who kept the fire lit while the rest of us forgot we had one. Come run this place. Not because I feel bad, because you're the only one left who still means it." Wyatt looked at the hand-painted sign over the pass. He looked at Poppy, spinning slowly on a counter stool. Home. He thought about a 12-year-old behind a different diner and a warm plate, and a man who never told him why. "Pops," he said, "what do you think? Should we run a diner? Does it have grilled cheese?" "It has everything." "Then yes," said Poppy, and went back to spinning, the largest decision of the day already made. "On the condition," Wyatt said slowly, "that we keep it open late, and that anybody comes in cold and broke, they eat on the house, and no manager ever gets to call that shrink." "That was always the rule," Genevieve said. "We just stopped writing it down." "Then I'll write it down," Wyatt said. And he took the pad of green guest checks out of his coat, and he wrote it on the top one, and he tore it off and slid it across the counter to her. And it was the same check, the same words, and this time she didn't have to hold it to her chest, because this time she got to pin it, in a frame, right there under Earl's sign, where 400 diners worth of people were going to read it. The original Holloways reopened for real that spring, and it was exactly as small and warm as it had been in 1958, and it never became a 500 location. Because it wasn't for the chain, it was for the block. Wyatt Corbin ran it. He trained the new cooks himself, and the first thing he taught every one of them, before the eggs, before the register, was to run the first plate under the hot tap. And when they asked why, he made them wait for the answer until they'd had a cold person come in on a cold night and watched what a warm plate did to a face. Poppy grew an inch and learned to read and reported to her kindergarten class that her dad's job was he makes sure nobody eats lonely, and no one ever again suggested she belonged anywhere but with him. Dale Prentice kept his mother in her care and lost the region and started over at the bottom of a store 2 states away. And once a month, for reasons he could not fully explain, he mailed Wyatt a photograph of a plate he'd warmed, which is not forgiveness exactly, but is the long, slow work that comes after it, done with the hands over time, The only way it's ever really done. And Genevieve Holloway had her own booth, the second one from the door, and she sat in it most evenings. An old woman nobody was afraid of, and every so often a person would come in off the cold street with nothing, and Wyatt would call back, "Warm one up," and someone would run a plate under the hot tap and set it down and say the sentence that was framed on the wall over the pass. The sentence a young man with $40 had believed in 1958, and a cold cook had believed at 12, and an old woman had gotten back on a bench in January. No one eats cold on a cold night. Not in that house, not ever. And the stove stayed lit for as long as there were hands to feed it, which, it turned out, was going to be a very long time.